Bruce Afram ye munnamateeka wa Kyagulanyi Center mu Robert Bobi Wine Nupu People Power munnankyukakyuka okuva ali mu ggwanga la America eyawaaba omusango gwa mwami Museveni ne mutabani we Muhoozi Kainerugaba mu kkooti y'ensi yonna ogw'okutulugunya okutta okusaanyaawo okutyobola eddembe ly'obuntu mu ggwanga Uganda. Bruce Afram ye yateekayo omusango guno ng'alina Kyagulanyi Center mu Robert Bobi Wine musango gwe mwalabyeko jjojuzi mu mawulire g'ensi yonna nga buli mwaguwandiikako nti kkooti y'ensi yonna Icc ekkiriza okuwulira omusango guno okunoonyereza ku musango guno era mwami Museveni bwe anaazuulwa ng'obujulizi obwaweereddwayo bw'abantu 215 obutuufu nnyo agenda kukwatwa ne mutabani we babitebye mu kkooti y'ensi yonna ate oluvannyuma baweebwa ekibonerezo. Kati nno olwaleero Bruce Afram munnamateeka ono wa Kyagulanyi Center mu Robert Bobi Wine awadde w'omusango we gutuuse era n'awa bannayuganda essuubi n'akamwenyumwenyu ku matama nti essaawa yonna mwami Museveni mugenda kulaba nga bamukubye ejjeke anti ebintu byongedde okusoba bafunye obujulizi obulala bwe bongedde okuteekayo mu kkooti y'ensi yonna ate nga buno bukambwe bubi nnyo era kkooti y'ensi n'obugira olulabye ku bujulizi buno ne beewuunya nnyo Museveni nti nabadde akola bino bulijjo ate nga akubikola ku bannansi b'alina okukuuma. Nkusaba otwegatteko tugende wali mu ggwanga la America. Bruce Afram munnamateeka wa Kyagulanyi wayogeredde ebigambo bino mu lukuŋŋaana lwa National Unity Platform olwa NUP Diaspora Convention 2023 wane Washington DC.
Recently, Bruce is the legal advisor to the National Unity Platform, a political party seeking to challenge Yoweri Museveni, and he's going to tell you a lot about the current ICC case we have against Museveni and his son. So welcome, Mr. Bruce.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And if you can't hear me, it'll let me know. I don't usually use microphones. We lawyers don't get them in courtrooms. We just have to raise our voices. I'm very gratified to be here and to have been invited here today. As you know, we've spent pretty much a solid 2 years in which we have been gathering evidence and bringing it forward to the ICC and to the world community. But before we talk about that, let me say how I became involved in this movement as an advisor. My interest in Uganda goes back, I'm one of those 60-year-old people Dr. Chingle was talking about. It goes back to when I was in high school. Now, at that time, there was a dictator in office named Idi Amin, and I used to write papers in high school on Idi Amin and his depredations. So I followed Uganda really as a child and later. I have a daughter who runs a summer camp, a Jewish religious camp, and there are 2 young men from Uganda who are in the Jewish community who've worked there for many years. So I began speaking to them one visiting day and asked them about the current political situation. And he told me this story, well, there's this man who's a singer, and he's going to run for president. And he's going to set aside this present dictator we have. Of course, I knew about Museveni. I didn't know about Bobi. And my first contact was with these 2 young men. And I said, look, when you go back at the end of the summer, let them know I'm here and I'm interested in helping. And through that, contact, David Lewis contacted me and several other people, and we began this strategy, the development of this strategy. And when the killings took place in November of that year, before the election, we developed the notion of gathering this evidence and presenting it to the ICC. So we've presented, thank you. We have presented 3 reports thus far, the latest being our formal complaint. Now, let me explain a bit about the ICC, and to some degree I want to make sure we don't build up hope in the wrong direction rather than in terms of the right direction. The ICC is a court. Its prosecutors have to make a decision as to what to do. Are you able to hear me? I hear an echo. Can you hear me all right? Okay, good. Thank you. And it's not clear what they do in any given case. Now, we presented 215 affidavits. One of them was Bobi's, actually, detailing torture, human rights abuses, murder, psychological abuses. Now, originally, we didn't have that. Our first two reports were from the media. But then we were able to gather over a period of a year with the help of many people, a collection of dossiers under oath describing in detail what has happened. This changes the picture. We're no longer submitting what's in the media to the court, but we're submitting affidavits under oath stating what happened to individuals. And we know most of those stories. You probably know a lot of them. You probably know people who have been victimized. People are taken off the street. They are dragged into cars. They're often beaten on the floor of the car for hours as they drive to a detention center. There, they're often forced into psychological torture, dancing for 12 or 15 hours in a row. Sometimes they make them listen to Bobby's music, actually, and they think that's a torture. They don't realize that's actually giving hope to the victim. But they make them dance for 12, 15 hours, and they beat them when they fall. Then they whip them with wires. Sometimes they electrocute them. One man was told, certifies that he was told to urinate into a hole that was wired, and he was then electrocuted. People have had pieces of their body pulled off, pincers taking their flesh off, fingers cut off, testicles damaged, if not pulled off. Vicious tortures practiced by ordinary Ugandans who are following orders. And this is one of the points of the ICC case, that it's not just going to be Museveni and his son. Ultimately, it will be anyone who takes place in these actions. We've listed 26 officials, some of them relatively low-ranking in our complaint. One of them was Speaker Among, who associated herself with a torture center. Another is General Alehu, who we know what he has done. But others are lower ranking, unknown sometimes. And the point of this process is that we know who is doing these things. And when a police officer decides to participate, and many don't, many are loyal to the Constitution and the law. But some are not. Some are scared, so they go along. Some want power, so they do this. But we will know who they are. You can take your name tag off, but you can't hide your voice, and you can't always hide your face. And people have a way of knowing. Ultimately, the law will descend upon those who do these things. Museveni, Muhuzi, and others. But also the police officer and the soldier, the ordinary person who engages in these tortures. Now, those of you who are in the 60s will remember East Germany. Those of you who are 30 or 35 might not be that familiar with this history. But if you remember East Germany, it was a communist government formed after World War II. West Germany was democratic. And in East Germany, people were shot as they tried to leave the country, as they tried to go over the fence or go over the wall. Some were arrested and abused in prison. And when the communists fell, and they fell peacefully, they left power in 1989 and 90, those officials and those guards who did those things were put on trial. And the reason they were put on trial was very simple. They violated German law. They took their power and they assumed as an attribute of sovereignty that they could abuse the human rights of those who disagreed with them. But the law was always there. The law was always there in front of them. They chose to disregard it. And so when the communist regime left power, many of these people were put on trial. Museveni and Muhuzi and those working with them have developed a false understanding of power. Power is always mediated ultimately by the force of law. What these people have done not only violates international law and human rights law, It violates Uganda law. And there will be a change of authority in Uganda. There will be a change of government. And when that happens, the law will still be there. And that's the point of the ICC process. We don't know what the ICC will ultimately do in this case or any other given case. We know in the Kasese case, they concluded, although these things happened, there was not a sufficient pattern to warrant international prosecution. Fair enough. Maybe that was a wrong decision. We don't know what they will say here. We don't know how they will balance this case versus other cases. But what we are doing with the ICC case is something much bigger than just the ICC. What we are doing is we are beginning the process of holding to the law those who break the law, those who break human beings, those who abuse human beings. That is ultimately why we have brought this case. It almost does not matter what the ICC says, because we have gathered the evidence, and that evidence will be used someday in some forum, whether it's in a freed Uganda court, or in the ICC, or in some other state court, such as Spain, that maintains universal jurisdiction over torture. That evidence will be used. But it's being used right now in a very big way. Remember all that talk about Muhoozi succeeding his father? You know, Muhoozi is going to be the next in line, as if Africans somehow just accept a king anointing his son. Muhoozi is no longer considered by anyone to be next in line. Do you remember the New York Times headline? Did you all see that? Museveni and Muhoozi and his son Muhoozi identified as running torture centers? And then there's the Guardian headline, even worse for them. Those discredit these people. Muhoozi is no longer looked on by anyone as a successor to anything. He will no longer have legitimacy or credibility. That is partly why we have gathered this evidence and brought it to the world's attention. And so remember, we don't know what the ICC prosecutor will do. They must look at this evidence and decide not if it happened, not if it broke the law, but whether they have jurisdiction in particular. We don't know what they will say. But what we have done is we have brought the force of evidence and law to the forefront of the world in connection with this regime. That is the fundamental point of what we're doing. So when you speak to people, make them realize that what we've done is much more than just ask the ICC to take a case. We have begun the process of holding this regime accountable to the law. And that is the fundament of what we are doing. I'd like to speak a little bit about related issues. Ultimately, all dictatorships fail. They all fail. Now, it's very interesting. I took the train down with my wife yesterday from Princeton, and the conductor decided he would be a historical guide, so he kept on giving a talk over the loudspeaker on the train, discussing American history. And one thing he said, I sat up and was shocked. He said, you know, when George Washington became the first president of the US, he served 2 terms and deliberately retired to set a precedent. That was one of the great moments of history, by the way, that a president had willingly left office. He could have stayed on, he could have been a king for life, but he left office to set a precedent. And the conductor said, well, you know, when we started out in America, he was actually a man from the Caribbean, so he was basically taking on America as his own. He said, we didn't have presidents for life. And I sat up and I said, well, that's an idea. No presidents for life. Now, what does that remind me of? The point is that Ugandans also are waking up to the absurdity of a man who thinks he should serve as their elected leader for 40 years. And the work we've done with the ICC gathers the evidence that shocks people into a consciousness that enough is enough. Now in 2026, I believe this gentleman here will be running for president. And the people of Uganda will again vote, and they do vote. And there is an election, and there are millions of people who vote, and nobody keeps people from the polling place. They may try to rip up the ballots afterwards. They may add several 100,000 ballots to the box. We have nice films showing that. But ultimately, the power of a dictator to maintain forcible rule through election does depend on people voting. You can only fake so many votes. You can't fake 5 million votes. You might fake 200, 300, 400,000 and alter the balance. But because of what we've done and the evidence we've manifested, I believe very deeply that the people of Uganda in 2026 will collectively begin to say to themselves, this is enough. You know, we heard that man on the train and say there are no presidents for life. It came across the Atlantic, right to Africa, and they said, we know we don't have to have presidents for life. And I think the evidence we've manifested and the proof of what has been happening is going to shock people in Uganda into changing how they vote. Now, most voted for Bobi Wine, obviously. But enough were conservative and loyal to the original Museveni, who came out as a liberal, that they did vote for him. Some did. But that's going to change in 2026, because dictatorships fail when the psychology of the people changes. That's the fundamental point of dictatorship. When the psyche of the voter, of the citizen, shifts, the dictator loses authority. Now, after we released our complaint and the New York Times ran a story, Bobi took a tour. It was of Eastern Uganda, Bobi, I think it was. And number one, he was on the radio. Usually the regime blocks the radio station. Bobi can't even get a hotel room because they threaten all the hotel managers. But this time they didn't. The New York Times headline spoke around the world. And some people may wonder, well, why did we wait? Why didn't we hold a press conference? The New York Times very carefully approached me for about 4 weeks. And finally, we decided that we'll let them have the story. And the headline they issued has the effect almost of a statement, almost of US policy. That headline was very significant. From that moment on, Museveni and his regime could no longer actively interfere with Bobi's actions. And not only did Bobi have unlimited use of the radio, but he traveled and a group of 100,000 people were with him. And on the train and say there are no presidents for life. It came across the Atlantic, right to Africa, and they said, we know we don't have to have presidents for life. And I think the evidence we've manifested and the proof of what has been happening is going to shock people in Uganda into changing how they vote. Now, most voted for Bobi Wine, obviously. But enough were conservative and loyal to the original Museveni, who came out as a liberal, that they did vote for him. Some did. But that's going to change in 2026, because dictatorships fail when the psychology of the people changes. That's the fundamental point of dictatorship. When the psyche of the voter, of the citizen, shifts, the dictator loses authority. Now, after we released our complaint and the New York Times ran a story, Bobi took a tour. It was of Eastern Uganda, Bobi, I think it was. And number one, he was on the radio. Usually the regime blocks the radio station. Bobi can't even get a hotel room because they threaten all the hotel managers. But this time they didn't. The New York Times headline spoke around the world. And some people may wonder, well, why did we wait? Why didn't we hold a press conference? The New York Times very carefully approached me for about 4 weeks. And finally, we decided that we'll let them have the story. And the headline they issued has the effect almost of a statement, almost of US policy. That headline was very significant. From that moment on, Museveni and his regime could no longer actively interfere with Bobi's actions. And not only did Bobi have unlimited use of the radio, but he traveled and a group of 100,000 people were with him. That's right. Imagine that, 100,000 people, and they were left totally unimpeded by the government. The government can no longer arbitrarily arrest and abuse people, at least in public. 3 months ago, they would have broken up that group and not let it gather. 3 months ago, Bobi would not have got anywhere near a radio. But that changed. And that's the power of law when the evidence is publicized around the world. And undoubtedly, this pattern can continue. Now imagine a group of 100,000 people protesting, standing with Bobi, standing at a rally, and the police or the army begin to shoot. Imagine how that will look to the world. Does anyone think Museveni now will dare to take that chance? That will create the indictment. That will yield the immediate indictment by the ICC. We'll have no choice. And so we have already shifted the psychological dynamic in Uganda. And remember, all dictatorship is psychological in the end. And the dictatorship ends when the people change and when the dictator knows that he can no longer continue with business as usual. Now, if you remember Romania, there was a communist leader by the name of Ceausescu. Now, Ceausescu ran a pretty vicious Stalinist regime, and all of a sudden, in 1989, he fled. Now, there are other forces building up in Poland and East Germany challenging the communist dictatorships. Ceausescu gave a speech, and all of a sudden, instead of having an obeisant crowd cowering to what he said, people started booing. If you remember this. And Ceausescu had never heard a boo in his life. That's right, yes. And so Ceausescu fled. That was the end of his regime, and he fled for one reason. He understood the psychology of the people had changed. And when that moment is met, the regime's power fails. So the next time there is a gathering of 100,000 or 200,000 or more, the regime has two choices. It can fire or round people up and abuse them and be seen in the entire world community as doing so. Or it can take the legally safe approach and allow the protest and gathering to continue. Either way, and this is the beauty of it, either way, its power is gone. If it shoots, its power is gone. It's a criminal regime. And if it can't shoot and is forced to allow the protest to continue, its psychological power is gone. And that is what happened. And that is what we saw with those 100,000 people who accompanied Bobi. This is the beginning of the turn. Now, it takes a long time for a large vessel to make a turn. An aircraft carrier will take a nice hour and a half just to turn around. A country is a bit of an aircraft carrier, but this is the beginning of the turn. The credibility of the regime is now challenged, damaged, and in fact destroyed by the evidence, not by the ICC complaint, but by the evidence we've brought forward. And so it does not matter what, in the end, the ICC chooses to do. This is the message I would like to ask you to take away with you. What matters is the evidence that we've manifested and the change in the world's understanding of what has happened. When those 54 people, probably 100, were killed in November of that year, Museveni was able to get away with saying, well, there were officers who overreacted. But no one can get away with saying there were officers who overreacted when we read these 215 affidavits. We have 4 individuals who identify Lieutenant General Muhoozi, an absurd title if ever there was one, running and operating and commanding torture centers. 4 individuals who were abused brutally, and we have their affidavits. One of them who was Kakwenza, whom you know. The others are going to be confidential still. Who defined the abuse they experienced in detail, and then they each say they were called into a meeting at the torture center with Muhoozi. Muhoozi was in command of these centers, and we now have the evidence that demonstrates that. Muhoozi is identified as an individual operating a criminal enterprise, and that's an extraordinarily serious fact. So bear in mind what we've achieved is the delegitimization of this regime. And that is the fundamental achievement thus far. Now, this is not the end of it, obviously. We don't know what the ICC will do, but we know what must continue. Obviously, Bobi's work continues, without question. But Bobi can't be alone. We've given new protection to the people of Uganda through this process. But that protection must be used. Freedom doesn't come from the outside. No nation was ever freed from dictatorship by outsiders, by a court or by a government from abroad or by the UN or anyone else. Dictatorship and authoritarianism end only internally. Now, we're not stopping this process, but it can't just be this process. The people of Uganda must now take this newfound protection and use it. And one of the things I've learned in this work is that Ugandans culturally are very nice people. And generally very calm and generous and loving people. Now, that being said, it's a little hard, if that's the way you see the world, to stand in the street and protest. So we have to marry that wonderful culture to the need to speak out. Because remember, authoritarians benefit from the decency of the people of their country. Remember in America, there were almost no slave rebellions. Do you know that? As bad as slavery was in this country, there were almost no slave rebellions. And slaves often were the vast majority of the population and were skilled. Many knew how to use weapons. Many knew how to use tools. They could have overcome their white masters in the South, but they didn't, because they were decent human beings who didn't want to kill the people they had grown up with. And that's how slavery maintained its power, by capitalizing on the inherent decency of its victims. And that's what dictators do. They know the average person does not believe in violence, and they can capitalize on that. Now, Dr. King showed us something, and Bobi does exactly the same thing, that the peaceful protest is powerful. So we have to take that decency in the Ugandan people and merge it to peaceful protest. We've given protection through the ICC, but now we need to take that a step further. People need to understand they need to speak out in Uganda and join together en masse. There was a thought I had and I just lost it. I apologize. Thank you. That's the essential message, that we've started the process. We have delegitimized this regime. We've delegitimized it in the world's understanding through this evidence and in the understanding of the people of Uganda. But that can't be all. The people of this nation must inherently bring that forward. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Gandhi once wrote that the most violent and powerful form of protest he knows of in India was the hunger strike. And that's a strange thing to say, because Indians by nature are so concerned about their neighbor that when they see someone on a hunger strike, they become violently angry at the cause of the hunger strike. And so the decency and humanity of people can be made into something that lets us speak out. And that's the essential message I want to leave, that we take this forward. We went to the ICC. They may take this case. We brought our evidence. We've delegitimized this government. The Ugandan people are now seeing it differently. We've taken the power of oppression away from Museveni in many respects. Now we must use that. And so I would encourage people to speak out in Uganda and to engage in peaceful protest. Because there is now protection that comes from the rule of law. By the way, do you remember the Daily Monitor article that came out, I guess it was 2.5 weeks ago? 2 front-page stories derived from the ICC case. That was rather extraordinary. That's a demonstration of the new weakness of the regime and the strength of those who wish to speak out. The law has given us this power. So I want to thank you all for hearing me out today. I don't know if anyone has any questions. I'm certainly happy. I don't know what time we have, but I'm certainly happy to answer a few questions. And I want to acknowledge Bobi Wine and what he has done. I mean, it's truly extraordinary that he has committed himself personally in this way. You know, there is danger in this work, and we've seen that happen. And I just want to acknowledge that, and the leadership of the NUP, David Lewis and others, I don't have everyone's name, and Barbie for her commitment, because this movement requires people dedicated, and then they can lead. And so I want to acknowledge that. And thank you all for the opportunity to serve in this way. So if anyone has questions, I'm really happy to take some.
I used to work with the United Nations for a long time. Our problem with ICC was privately as staff members. It does not seem to have arrest power in any country. For example, a few years ago, I think Sudanese former president had
Thank you for those comments. Unfortunately, they can't impound the airspace, but the ICC does have a power, and that is most governments will arrest on that warrant a person who's been indicted by the ICC. Now, not every government. Putin and China do not follow the rule of law. We can't expect that. But I can tell you this, Museveni and Muhoozi can no longer really travel freely. They might make it to Kenya. That's pretty much where their range of power ceases. They're afraid. Well, Russia is a lawless country. It doesn't follow the rule of law. But, well, you can't stop them, you can't pull the plane down. But really, there is a power of arrest. Most governments will arrest someone. So their place to move is limited. If they show up in Spain or France or Germany or the US, they'll be arrested. Then they'll be taken in handcuffs to The Hague. So there is a real power. Nothing is perfect, but remember, the goal of what we're doing is to demonstrate the reality of what has happened. And even if the ICC doesn't act officially. By the way, I want to say one thing. There's a lot of talk now about whether the ICC focuses too much on African governments. All right, you've all heard that. As if somehow it's racist to investigate African dictators who abuse human rights. This is a bogus argument. It is not racist to investigate African dictators. It is protecting the rights of African people to investigate those dictators. And the notion that somehow it's a racist act to focus on African governments is nonsense. This is designed to protect the rights of the people who live there. And so disabuse yourselves of that notion. Thank you. I don't know how much time we have, but any other questions, I'm happy to. I don't control the questioning.
Mr. President, thank you for your elaborate presentation. My question will be short but direct. What will be the time frame to get the tangible result in terms of your experience? That's number one. Number two, Museveni as a corrupt leader, what can you, as a person, do to his proxies like the lobbyists, who can influence those people making decisions in the ICU? Because some of us, we may have this outcome, but sometimes we may be worried because Museveni has been in power for so long and is a corrupt guy who can underground influence the decision in that court. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad, your question was direct but potent, okay? And the question really is, doesn't Museveni have enough power to corrupt the process? That's really what you're asking, I think. Let me answer it this way, and I don't mean to sound disrespectful. I think you are being a little overawed by the perception of Museveni's power. If that's what I think. It's very easy to assume the person in power can somehow pull strings around the world. Now, Uganda does have a delegate on the ICC, but it doesn't mean that the ICC is going to be swayed by that individual. And remember something, that individual knows there's a day of reckoning coming. And they may not be willing to sell out for Museveni. So don't assume the power of Museveni exists at all internationally, and don't assume that his minions will necessarily follow suit. They too are worried, and that's the idea of this process. As far as the timeline goes, that's impossible to say. And in a real sense, it doesn't matter to us. As long as this investigation goes on and it hangs over the head of this government, there is power in that. So don't worry about how long it takes. I hope I've answered your questions. Thank you.
If you don't mind, could you talk a little bit more, because I wanted to sink deep in the analogy you gave yesterday. Before you said that, I was putting a note to send to you. I wanted you to mention Ceausescu, because this is a powerful dictator. He's addressing the people, and then somebody decides to do it. The first person to put instead, that increased the movement.
Right.
And that's an important point, Mr. Brother Uganda, to sink deeper. So could you expand on that?
Yes, I'll be glad to. And I apologize, I have no idea what our time frame is, but I assume the controlling parties will tell me. So thank you. I saw you nodding vigorously when I mentioned Ceausescu, Bobby too, actually. It's an amazing chapter in history that this Stalinist dictator who had enormous power in Romania somehow understood he had to leave power because the crowd turned on him. It was simple speech, like he'd given hundreds and hundreds of times before, and all of a sudden the crowd turned on him. So he offers to raise salaries, and it gets worse. And this is why, with respect to the gentleman who raised the question about corruption of Museveni, ultimately corruption won't work. Offer more money. But once the people have gotten to a point of moral anger and understand that what has happened transgresses rules of decency, you can bribe them all you want, it's not going to change anything. Ceausescu attempted that in that talk, clumsily, and it got worse for him. Museveni, by the way, every single person who has been arrested and kept in detention in Uganda, including Bobi, actually, has been offered a bribe. They've been offered the opportunity. Bobi was offered bribes indirectly. I think people were told, will you tell Bobi Wine we have something for him? We have a job in government for him. Other people were given legal jobs. They were offered law jobs. People were offered money. And I believe Museveni meant it. He would have given them the money. But they did not accept it. And in fact, it makes it worse. And so by trying to bribe the people, once people have reached a point of moral outrage, the problem gets worse for the regime. So I firmly believe that, for example, I think I lost this, there it is important to understand that once that psychology changes, the regime can't go back again. And I think we're at that point now, and we need to enhance that process. Yeah, yes, is there any other question? I'm sorry if I could interrupt. I apologize, but you're going too fast. I couldn't quite follow your question.
I said that, is it under the ICC policy to take the people who are committed prior in their time in the government after they have been removed, or they can be questioned before they've been removed? Because we have seen it in Uganda, the government of NLM and they have Museveni and his family, they have committed enough cases to be answered in the ICC court. What are you waiting for? Then another question, another thing which I also want to comment that. You say that most of the dictators cannot be removed by external forces, which is quite good. And I really agree with you. The question is, what have you done to support those suffering people down there in their government, under their government dictatorship rules? Because the people are trying to react, they are going to the streets, but you see that the ICC is pressing their door. What are you waiting for that essence to help these vulnerable Ugandan Africans who are suffering down there?
I think you're saying, why is the ICC waiting? Is that the basic thrust of the question? Thank you.
Bruce, I think the first part, he also wants to know, do they only indict and
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was wondering about that. Okay, let's clarify. Okay, thank you. To the gentleman who asked the question, first of all, if your question was suggesting that I am part of the ICC in some way, that's not correct. So I was puzzled when I said, what are you doing? When you said, what are you doing? And I didn't quite get that. I am not with the ICC. I'm simply a lawyer. And on behalf of Bobi and Amos Katumba and others, I have filed papers with the ICC as a lawyer representing a group of people, and in this case, 215 victims. So to begin with, I'm not part of them. We have asked their prosecutor, who is a lawyer working for the ICC, to launch their own investigation. That's the first step. And so what we do is we ask them, we say to them, we have the evidence that justifies the inquiry. We want you to launch your investigation. We're asking them to do that, and they're an independent force. No one can tell them what to do, and they'll act as they see fit. Now, obviously, everybody in some way is political. Does the ICC respond to political forces? Probably not, but they might respond to criticism that we look too much at Africa. We can't stop that negativity if it happens. However, we have given them the evidence to work with. The second point is, they do not only go after a person once they're out of power. Putin's not out of power. They indicted Putin, for example. They indicted Milosevic, who was in power in Serbia. And so the ICC's power is not used only to those who have been forced out. They use their authority to those who are in power. And that's very important. If a sitting president or a general or a speaker of a house is indicted by the ICC, they lose all international legitimacy, except perhaps in China or Russia. South Africa, maybe. That's a bit of a hybrid problem. Yeah, well, Putin's never leaving Russia, I can tell you that. So they don't go only after those who are out of power, they go after those who are in power. I think that addressed your questions. I'm not sure if there's another aspect to it. Thank you.
So we have one more question here. The last one for you.
Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. My fears, not so different from those aired out by one of my colleagues, except that mine are not born out of the perception of Museveni's power, but the weaknesses in the international system of which the ICC is part. That the examples that you have pointed out of people that have been held accountable may be out of coincidence, but have only taken place when there has been policy shift in the Western capitals. And why I'm asking is the supplementary role that for us who are not in the court, but are citizens of Uganda and friends of Uganda, the role that we need to play to supplement the efforts of those that are pushing the case in court. Because many cases, and this has been part of the debate about the effectiveness of the ICC, is that many times the dictators, the violators of human rights, who enjoy the protection of powerful governments in the global system, are not held accountable. And the one we are dealing with is one of such people, because of the role he plays in the region for some of those powerful governments. So what roles can we play, supplement your efforts to make sure that the efforts that you are putting in are not frustrated by the interference of the powerful governments of the world whose interests he serves?
Thank you for that very thorough question. It really does get to the core of the problem. Now, obviously, the US and Britain, primarily, are responsible for maintaining Museveni in power. There's no question about that. Israel, to a degree, allows security equipment, surveillance equipment to be sold to Uganda's government as well. Mostly, it is the US and Britain who maintain this regime, both militarily and through money. About $1 billion a year goes to the government, and that helps prop up the government. Now, as Dr. Chingle said before, we don't really need the outside money, do we? It's used as a means of perpetuating those in power that outsiders favor. And that's the problem with foreign aid, and African governments and societies have fallen victim to it. Aid is a weapon used by the West, primarily. Our aid is used for political purposes. Now, all of that being said, the US is not an evil regime. It's not going to send troops in to keep Museveni in power. It sponsors him because of a somewhat racial attitude in the US State Department that African governments need, African societies need a strong man to rule. Let's face it, there is this attitude prevailing in the West, primarily in the US and Britain, that Africans need a strong man. Never a strong woman, by the way, a strong man. And this is fundamentally a racial conception of how the West sees power in Africa. It's wrong. We've seen many, many examples of democracy in Africa. And it's fundamentally biased and ignorant. It is a racial point of view the US practices. But the US ultimately is not going to use force to keep Museveni or any other ally like that in power. If a democratic election clearly demonstrates he's lost authority, the US will not stand in the way. I don't speak for the US, I'm just analyzing US policy. Don't mistake that, I'm not part of the US government. But ultimately, what role should the Ugandan people play is the question. Now, you put the question as what role supplementary to the process can we play? Well, there's, I think, the error, if you don't mind my saying so. Your role in Uganda as Ugandans is not supplementary. Your role is primary. Bobby's role is primary. My role is supplementary. All right, that's what we have to change. We have to change this quiescent obeisance and the notion that somehow outsiders have the primary duty to make this change. I'm a catalyst, but a catalyst makes a reaction. That reaction must be Ugandan. So what role can Ugandans play? Not as supplements, but as citizens who are demanding their rights. Once we change that mental perspective, we change everything. That's the whole point of Bobby's campaign and the NUP's campaign. What role can be played? Well, there's a multiplicity of roles. First of all, Uganda is broken down into a set of local governments. Every town and district has a chair. Is that correct? Those chairs are often independent people. They're not all national resistance movement toadies. Many of them are quite independent. Many of them, probably a majority, support the NUP. You can go to your chair. You can go to your district meetings and speak. You're not going to get arrested for speaking against torture and against the regime. Imagine if 5 million Ugandans went to district meetings all over the country on a given day and spoke about torture. Imagine the impact of that on the regime. That suddenly every district meeting, which the regime can't shut down, has people complaining about torture and abuse. That is one thing that can be done by Ugandans. That is a painless, simple thing, but immensely powerful. That's the first thing, to start to speak out again as citizens, saying, I have the primary right to be heard. That's the first step. That is not a supplement, that is the primary move. And then the primary move is to organize another 100,000 person gathering. Not even if Bobby is there. Organize it in your own district. Organize a meeting, a public meeting. Hold public meetings in every district, in every city, in every town, in every county, talking about change. Have a public meeting to talk about changing the Constitution. to get rid of military jurisdiction, which is what is used to arrest people. Have a simple meeting like that. Every district can hold a meeting to discuss whether the Constitution should be amended to eliminate military jurisdiction over the citizen. No one's going to get arrested. That will have immense power. Do this over and over again and begin to organize public meetings and protest. Yes, in some occasions, the government might react with violence, but they can only do that once or twice and on a small scale. And that would be tragic, but people are killed anyway. Far better to begin to assert rights as citizens. I hope I've given some positive examples. There are a myriad of things that can be done, but the first step is to get over the notion that we are, in Uganda, only a subsidiary of this effort. Ugandans are the primary effort. Remember the Arab Spring movements? Those were internal movements. Now, they weren't entirely successful. Some governments later became repressive, but they were not led from the outside. They were led internally. And we have a movement, and it's a legitimized movement. I want to say one more thing, and then I'll close. Uganda was given a great benefit by Britain when Britain left. That benefit was the rule of law. Uganda has a court system. It has lawyers who are well-trained. Most are committed to law. Some have become afraid and become tools of the government. But most have within them that core of belief in law. I've met Ugandan lawyers, and they are as competent and thoughtful and well-trained as American lawyers or British lawyers. Uganda was given this legal system. That tradition still exists. You were given a parliamentary system, and that tradition still exists. It's been abused, it's been straightened and foreclosed a bit, but it is still there. All of these tools exist to be used. The district government system is widespread. It is for you to use. Uganda was given an educational system. There are fine universities. There's a well-educated component of the people. Use these strengths. They're there and they're sitting there waiting to be used. They can also be used politically. And so I would say in closing, the rule of law is what we started with here. The rule of law is what must propel. Remember how Museveni came to power? He came to power through what? Guns. He said, I'm a liberal getting rid of a dictator, but he came to power through a gun. Bobi Wine doesn't have a gun. The NUP does not have a gun. It is a political movement based on the right under the rule of law to be heard. And that is ultimately its strength. Now, we're sitting here peacefully and safely in Arlington next to Washington. Could we have this meeting in Uganda? We might right now. I don't know. We might be able to right now. One could try and see what happens. If you're unwilling to try, then you can't get freedom. Freedom can be taken from the point of a gun, like Museveni has done, but it's also easily lost by fear. And so I would encourage people to leave here with the message that the strength in this movement is much stronger than Museveni and his government. And remember that and take that with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce, for that powerful speech. And I think
ebigambo mubiwulidde bannayuganda mwenna gye muli. Munnamateeka wa Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine omukulu Bruce ategeezezza nti bannayuganda kati muli free okukola buli kye mwagadde okuggyako mwa Museveni ng'oggyeko emmundu. Nti mutandike mu organizing okwekalakaasa okw'eddembe mu bitundu bya Uganda byonna. Ab'e Masaka mutandike okwekalakaasa mu ddembe. Abe Kampala mukole ekyo, abe Mbalala mukole ekyo, abe Mbale mukole ekyo, abe Gulu mukole ekyo, Pakwachi mukole ekyo, Jinja Iganga mukole ekyo. Mwenna bannayuganda gye muli mu bitundu ebyenjawulo mukole ekyo, mutandike okwekalakaasa mu mirembe. Namwe bannankyukakyuka mutandike okukola political meetings, mutandike okukola enkuŋŋaana ezoogera ku byobufuzi nga mwogera ku ngeri amagye gye geenyigira mu byokulonda kirina okukoma nga mugamba abantu era nga mubateekateeka nti nno kasita amagye galemera mu byokulonda bya Uganda tulina okwekalakaasa ntujjako Museveni. Abantu mugende nga mubateekamu ekibuli, nga mubateekamu ekiniga, nga mubateekamu okwekkiririzaamu nti Mwami Museveni asobola okuvaamu. Era mutegeke okwekalakaasa buli kadde mubikole nga mubiddiriŋŋana buli kaseera. Munnamateeka Bruce agamba kino kisobola nti kati wa Museveni watuuse anafuye nti okuva story aya obujulizi obwatwalibwa mu kkooti y'ensi yonna ICC lwe yakubwa mu lupapula lwa New York Times, Guardian n'empapula endala Daily Monitor eza Uganda byogedde nti kyawikeninga Mwami Museveni nti badikiteeta bonna batambulira ku psychology y'abantu kutiisatiisa ate nabo batya nnyo nti bwafunawo ekimutiisa ate atintima nnyo awulira nga agaweddemu nga bannansi babulako obubuzi kulerula gavumenti ye egwera ennume y'ekigo. Naawe ekyokulabirako nti the New York Times bwe yali yakawandiika eggulire erya kkooti y'ensi yonna nti ekkiriza omusango gwa Kyagulanyi gwe yawaayo ogwa Museveni okuba ne mutabani we nga batulugunya abantu ng'obujulizi babukkiriza 2015 nti Bobi Wine bwe yagenda Jinja teyakwatwako, bamuleka n'akola buli kyayagala era procession ne ziggwa bulungi. Kati naamutumye nammwe bannayuganda nti kati mubikole mubitamye Museveni nti bw'agezaako okwagala okukuba abantu amasasi okubatta ajja kuva mu ntebe kuba kati kkooti y'ensi yonna ejja kugaawugambye nti akwatibwe nga tewali na kuwozesebwa kwonna kuba kati amaaso gali ku ye nti bw'agezaako kugamba nno tagenda kubakuba mu masasi abaleke mwekalakaase mugenda kuyingira State House mumuggyeyo nga ne nabugisi mufungize nti either way Mwami Museveni agenda. Munnamateeka Bruce kyagezaako okubannyonnyola nti mwe mubikole lwaleero nkya mubiddemu mubiddiriŋŋane mubakozesa ensobi mukole nga mukola kubakozesa nsobi basobole kkooti y'ensi yonna basobole okulagira Mwami Museveni akwatibwe nti ate Mwami Museveni bw'anaatya okumukwata okukola ensobi okukuba abantu amasasi nalagira basigale tebafulumya amasasi ne mwekalakaasa mwongere kwekalakaasa nga mutambula mugenda mu State House muyingire State House mumukwate bibe bijja kuba bikomye nti either way Mwami Museveni alina engeri bbiri okuva mu buyinza zokka buli kyakola kimujja mu buyinza bw'abaleka mwekalakaase entebe agivaamu bw'abakuba amasasi temwekalakaasa entebe agivaamu kata kyalina kyakukola agambye nti ye asomye badikiteeta mu nsi yonna engeri gyebava mu buyinza nti kino kye baakoze Mwami Museveni kimugirawo mu ntebe nti badikiteeta batambulira kutya na kutiisatiisa abeera atya ate n'atiisatiisa nti kati bwe mugema okutiisatiisa nammwe ne mumutiisatiisa kuba naye aba atya ne mumugamba nti bw'okola kino kibaawo bw'okola kino kikutuukako kati naye aba mu kutya ategeeza nti Mwami Museveni kati ali mu kutya takyali yooli nti era kati Bobi Wine mugende mwekalakaase buli district mugituukemu nga mukuba enkuŋŋaana kale Mwami Museveni abeeko kyakola nti wonna waakolera ensobi obujulizi eri nga bweyongera okupayiringa mu kkooti y'ensi yonna nti ate ayinza n'okukola ensobi ennene mu kantu ak'okusaagaawo ne bagamba akwatibwe nti bagamba akwatibwe aba takyasobola kutambula kugenda mu nsi yonna okuggyako ayinza okugendako e Rwanda okumpi waalina minywanyi gye n'agendako e Kenya waalina minywanyi gye n'agendako e Tanzania waalina minywanyi gye nti naye kikamutanda nti ekirwadde kimuluma oba nti afunyemu obuzibu oba mpu alina trip agenda mu Europe oyo aba mukwate ng'etteeka oba mbu agenda mu America aba mukwate oba mu South America aba mukwate oba Canada aba mukwate nti mpozi okuggyako eyo China n'eyo mu Russia bayinza obutamukwata kuba abeeyo nabo tebagoberera amateeka. So awadde bannayuganda amagezi nti kati essaawa y'eno temudda mabega mwongere kubikola mubikole ate nga mubikolesa maanyi na ffujjo naye mu mirembe nti kino Mwami Museveni tagenda kuddamu kuba mu tear gas nti byonna byabadde akola bulijjo n'akuba tear gas n'agwa Bobi ku radio n'akuba abantu emiggo ku luno amaaso gonna ag'ensi gali ku ye buli kitangaaza kiri ku ye olw'eggulire lyafuluma mu the New York Times nti abakulembeze mu America bonna amaaso kati gali ku Uganda bwe twagala tulabe obujulizi obwateereddwa ku Museveni obwakkiriziddwa kkooti y'ensi yonna kati waagwana. So kati ensobi yonna gy'akola oba kuba masasi kuba abantu kubatta entebe agivaamu ba wabakubira bw'ati kkooti y'ensi yonna ejja kulagira akwatibwe bwe kiba kisusse ejje lijje liyambeko bannayuganda beekalakaasa bye baakola Gaddafi nti bw'abaleka nti mwekalakaase atya okumujja mu ntebe tagenda bakuba masasi mujja kwekalakaasa mwongere kuwera mumalire mu State House nakasero n'entebe aleka kukola tondeka nnyuma bannayuganda mweddize ensi yammwe. Bigambo bya munnampadeeka wa Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine Bruce agamba nti guno wano bali ku primary bali ku foundation wano omusingi gwe baliko gwe gutwala mwami Museveni nti bingi ebirina okukolebwa naye kino ekyakoleddwa ate kya muwendo nnyo nti kati nammwe bannayuganda mulina okwekalakaasa olwaleero enkya luli era wadde Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine omulimu n'abannakibiina kya National Unity Platform abakulembeze mwenna nti mukube buli district nga mukubayo enkuŋŋaana buli kanyumiro ka Uganda mukubemu enkuŋŋaana ate ng'abantu mubagamba nti one day tugenda Kampala tugenda Ntebe ti abantu mubakyajinge mumala obbakyajinga mulangirire olw'e Kampala kati ffenna tusisinkana Kampala tugenda Ntebe. Mwami Museveni wagerezaako okukuba entebe agivaamu kuba amaaso gamuliko bwagezaako okubaleka entebe agivaamu kuba amaaso gamuliko nti mwe abantu mubakyajinge mubagambe nti kkooti ensi yonna amawanga gonna amawulire gonna kati gali Uganda gabatunuulidde bwe bati kati mugongere okugasensera mugateeke ku bunkenke buli kamera ejje Uganda nga mutandise okunyeenya ekintu temukkiriza 2026 kutuuka mu kitandike kati Museveni kajja mujjuutuka. So bye bigambo mubiwulidde bya munnamateeka wa Kyagulanyi Ssentamu Robert Bobi Wine omukulu Bruce okuva mu ggwanga lya America eyatwala omusango gwa mwami Museveni mutabani we n'abalala mu gavumenti ye ogw'okutulugunya bannansi era obujulizi obwaweebwayo ne bukkirizibwa kkooti y'ensi yonna nga buliko n'ebirayiro. Baasooka ne baayo obujulizi just stories ezivudde mu TV ez'enjawulo ku mitimbagano egy'enjawulo kkooti y'ensi yonna ng'obujulizi tekyabuwa nnyo makulu ne basalawo ne batandika okufeffetta obujulizi obuweebwako n'obujulizi nga oli awa obujulizi ng'ate mwali nga n'ebyayogerako birabika ne babikola bwe bantu 215 Museveni yandiba n'agenda ebigambo byayonoonese dda amulabako amukwateko omwana oyo kuba essaawa yerabika ng'eweddeyo nti bino bwe munaabikola ajja kuwalirizibwa either okuta entebe mu mirembe oba mu kugimugjamu nga teyeesikidde wadde akawande. Kale katulinde ffenna amaaso gateeke ku lutimbe naye nga mubitegedde bannayuganda nti mubikole mwami Museveni takyalina kyagenda kukola okuggyako bw'akolera bw'akubira amasasi avaamu bw'abaleka mwekalakaase era entebe agivaamu lwekyasigaza ekkubo limu kuva mu ntebe Uganda etereere. Mbagala nnyo mwenna ababaddeko mwebale kubaako mwebale kutuwagiranga akadde kakulu mwebale kubayo kadde kamu okulaba amawulire naye ate nga tulina okumanya ebifa mu ggwanga lyaffe. Omukama Katonda asaba bankuumire tujja kuba tuddamu tuwaye mweraba.